a weird angle to the waves. So when it's sitting at an angle to the waves, which is historical, yeah, it's not a modern day phenomenon. It's sitting at a weird angle to the waves for historical reasons, and so sand moves in net from one end to the other on average over a year, year after year after year. Hungry beaches require food. You've got to put sand. They've got to have sand coming in the top end. Now we've got hungry beaches all the way through here. It seems like historically we're aligned on an angle. Hungry beaches can be incredibly stable, you know, as long as the supply of sand is still coming in at the top end. If anything happens to that supply, like India, they're mining all the supply. So all their hungry beaches are all crooked to the waves. So the only way, it's very, very hard to find the sand to put in the top end. Now we know it's hungry all the way from South Australia right through and down. Sand is moving in net down towards Cape Otway and certainly around the Dutton Way. And so that distinction is really important. When you're coming to find a solution to how to fix these beaches, you've got to know, is it hungry or happy? Because you make a completely different solution and decision about what you're going to do if you work that out. You can do that with computer models, measurements, all sorts of things. We have wave climates globally, and we have all sorts of things that allow us to do that, but it's a fundamental choice that you must make and that you must find out. So if you put nourishment on a hungry beach, such as the nourishment on the end out here at the end of Nuns Beach, when the waves come, it just washes it all down, and you think it's gone. It hasn't gone, just happily on its normal journey, yeah? But it's gone from where you dropped it. This is nourishment put on a hungry beach. This is the future of the Dutton Way, really, with the seawalls. You know, they just get bigger and bigger and bigger as the water gets deeper out the front. And this nourishment just disappeared. And you see in the computer models, you know, you have a headland. These are currents, and the currents rush down. All the surfers know this without me telling them. You're out paddling on a headland, surfing the waves, and the currents rush down the headland and then turn and run on the beach. Yeah? It's not great science if you're a surfer because you've already seen it live. You've paddled hard against it to try and get back to the peak. So waves tend to push down along headlands. They push currents along headlands, and that from here it's pushing it around the corner down to the beach and on to the Dutton Way. A normal process and an important process, linking all the different parts of the beach into one. But what beaches tend to do, I've got some examples here, is this is leading to what we might have to do to fix the Dutton Way, is they tend to, this is Aragon Bay in the back of Sri Lanka, they tend to set up a beach on an angle that's pretty well imbalanced. Inputs of sand equals outputs, and then it can't keep that up forever, and it cuts back. It's like having a groin here, you know, and then it'll cut back and the next one, cut back and the next one. Now they're not all exactly parallel, these beaches. There must be some wave variations, but basically that's it. And then on a grand scale, you know, there's Warrnambool, there's Portland. We're looking at all these beaches that have essentially at a really big scale done that same thing. Now they're not on neutral alignment, they're a little bit out because in theory there was sand arriving from rivers, there was sand, you know, it may still be. Maybe the Murray has reduced the amount of sand that's coming out now. So those angles, there's Hampton and Black Rock, you know, Sandringham sort of area, same sort of phenomenon. And Moggs, Anglesey, you know, they're not exactly the same, but the principle's there. So what nature is doing there is trying to convert a hungry beach that requires a large amount of sand input to a happy beach so that it rotates around to be almost perpendicular, or if possible perpendicular to the waves. On a happy beach, you put nourishment, it doesn't go anywhere, right? Because the net movement of sand is zero. On an intermediate beach, half might go, and on a really hungry beach, the whole lot goes. Yeah? So the principle of designing coastal protection under climate change and under a future of reduced sand supplies, troubles everywhere, you know, water rising, sand falling apart, rivers blocked and all that, is that, and even in the old days used to be sand coming in across the continental shelf, it's not doing that anymore, is to try and align beaches onto the happy state. That's the basic premise of fixing the erosion on a beach. That way you don't have to keep pouring nourishment in one end and watching it disappear. And you'd never see a solution. You think, oh, we'll give up, we won't nourish, we'll just build a rock wall. Yeah? So if we come back then, at Portland it will be necessary to realign the beach orientations from hungry to happy, and it can be achieved with groins or reefs. Yeah? The precise solution needs detailed field data collection and modelling. The seawalls are another fundamental problem, and not doing that. They're not realigning the beach at all. They're just leaving the beach on the angle that you found it, and so they're not attacking the cause of the erosion. They are just protecting the land. Yeah? Sand must be bypassed to the port, and nourishment will be needed. And there's an example of 3 reefs, and so what's happened here is you rotate the beach over segment so that it's on a more happy alignment, and therefore you don't lose the sand so quickly. Yeah. And yeah, computer models are a bit complicated, but computer models can reproduce this sort of thing. 2 reefs, and that's the original beach is straight, and the final beach has got this big curve in it. And the groins, yeah, they've partially succeeded. They're quite short groins, but a lot of the time there is a bit of beach around these 2 groins in the WA. So you can do it with groins, and you can do it with reefs. If you do it with reefs, you can add a lot of amenity. That's a reef in New Zealand we built, which is now gone, unfortunately, because our management committee flew apart and the government pulled it out. But anyway, you can see some great surf on it. That's the reef on the left. And the ecology improvement on a reef is absolutely phenomenal, of course, if you use the right materials, and you can get amazing benefits for marine life. Reefs are always great. A lot of reefs have flat ledges and they don't have a lot of habitat. And finally, the port. I promised I would say two seconds on this. This is a little tiny piece of erosion which you should be taking a little bit of sand from out the front out there, lifting it out and putting it up on the beach. Yeah. I don't need any science story or tales, just advice from me while I'm here, put it on record. You need to go down there and get a little barge or an excavator, pull it up, put it on the beach and stop messing around. You're losing trees, losing all sorts. It's wrong. It's inside a port, there's no energy there. 30 grand, it'll probably last, or $20,000, it'll last 20, 30 years, 20 years at least. But you've got to just keep pulling it back every now and then, because there's not a lot of wave energy, so the sand tends to slump. So it's a little maintenance job, like running your botanical gardens. Costs a little bit to keep the gardens looking beautiful, and it costs you a little bit to tidy up the beach. Just put it in your gardening budget or something. Yeah. Okay. It's an absolutely trivial length, tiny piece of work, and it should be done urgently in my view. Right, so I won't go through that because I think I've said way too much anyway. Yeah, all right.
Right, we have some questions. Yeah. Anyone got any questions of Kerry?
Kerry, I manage the Almani farm at Narrawong, so this whole erosion issue is fairly close to me. We had to spend a huge amount of money putting in a rock wall, and we investigated every single possible scenario, including trucking sand down there, as an alternative to putting in a rock wall, which we knew exactly what would happen. Dr. Peter Riddell was the principal consultant for the work that was done down there. I'm just intrigued. You haven't spoken. You know, the scenario here is a classic blocking of longshore drift, and all that sand's on the south side of the lee breakwater is no longer, or has no longer been coming into the bay at 50,000 cubic metres that's required to stabilise the beaches. So, but now that has been restored, but the gap from so many decades of lack of nourishment is what we're feeling down there now.
Yeah.
And certainly the Almani farm has a substantial reef out the front of it, but we were still losing 10 metres a year. That's why we had to build the rock wall. But I'm just, you didn't talk about direct injection of sand. The issue that I can see, and the information that we, or our advice was that yes, the sand is being bypassing, but it could be decades before we see it down at Narrawong. Unless we truck it down or we extend the sand bypassing system to directly inject that sand onto the beaches that need the sand. So I'm just interested in your view on extending the distribution of the sand from Anderson's Point down the Dutton Way onto those beaches where it's really needed.
Yeah, 2 or 3 answers there. One, the first answer just is the last thing you've said, you know. You pick up sand from the upstream end and move it down to the downstream end.
No, pick it up from
from
where
here.
it's accumulated out.
Yeah. In theory, if the port's doing all the right things, which they really need to be forced to, because they're leaving a legacy for the residents of Portland,
I can assure you
and they need to be forced into that.
So,
No exceptions. And even if it's legal action. And I think, as long as they're getting it passed, taking sand to the far end of an eroding area, of course, is great for the person who gets it, but the negative for you would be that once it disappears, it's totally gone. If it's put further up, it dribbles down and you get a longer time span of joy from it. It seems you said a really good thing, that the legacy of so many years of negligence is having a bit of a cost, takes a bit of a while to capture that at whether 50's enough, And it also seems that globally we're seeing massive changes like sea level rise and sediment shortages, and that it's quite hard to nourish on a beach that's hungry, unless you've got a large wallet, because you're going to put it on and then 2 big storms and you'll be crying to your bank manager about it. And it's probably not a great idea. I think we're going to have to bite off eventually what I call grant schemes, which look at an entire sediment cell, and there might be 300 metre, 400 and 500 metre long groins every 2 kilometres that petition the whole beach and slow all the sand movement down. And for the government of Australia to even bite that off, I'm not sure they will, because the environmental sensitivities might prevent it. But I think we're going to need that. In your case, I think it's really, you would have got a lot of benefit with an existing reef by just topping that up, and then maybe even some of your inlet outlet pipes could have somehow connected to that offshore reef for stability or something, and it would have given you a better benefit, because the rocks are going to eventually, waves are just going to come crashing over, and you're you're far enough around to be exposed to big waves. And but putting sand on the beach, I don't think I would, without some form of larger decision structures, I wouldn't highly recommend, even though nourishment is the best option environmentally.
So Kerry, I'll just make a comment. I'm Richard Beale, I'm a design consultant at the Port of Portland. I've worked for the Port on a number of occasions since the mid-80s, and certainly have a good history of what's happened here and why. Probably the main comment is that the deficit from 1955 through to the early 90s, the port was owned by the state government, and they neglected to shift any sand since the construction of the port through to the early 90s.
Yeah.
So their very first campaign, they shifted, I think it was 200 or 250,000 from a major dredging campaign, and topped up Numbs Beach and a lot of the coastline through to Anderson's Point. They did inundate a bit at that stage because there was a big slug of sand in one hit. But from then on, prior to that, there was nothing. From then on, the port was sold to now the Port of Portland Proprietary Limited. And in that sale, there was an obligation that was signed off that the Port of Portland Proprietary Limited need to shift the stated 50,000 cubic metres per year of littoral drift. There was a commitment in perpetuity that sand be bypassed past the port to the location currently, which is Anderson Point. So that commitment is in place, and it's a legal binding document.
Is it per year or an average
Per annum.
over several years?
Per annum, they do have a...
We do have a biannual agreement,
Yeah.
so
Oh,
we
yeah.
can shift...
100 every two.
Yeah, every
Mm,
two.
Mm.
So that then comes back to the inundation scenario as well. So the more you shift continually, then the less issues you're going to have as far as inundating, seagrass,
Yeah.
abalone habitat. So that's the current status.
Mm.
And I think we all agree the deficit from 1955 through to the early 90s.
Mm.
You know, there was an accumulation of sand in the numbers of millions of cubic metres,
Which is
Yeah.
still there.
which is still there, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think it comes back to a government decision. You know, for you to nourish that beach along the North Shore, obviously there's sand there.
Yeah.
How
There's
do
still
we-
sand on the outside of the wall, though.
Oh, there's, look, that's what
Large
I'm saying.
amount,
There's
yeah.
2.5 million cubic metres.
Sitting there, yeah.
And I think, just to answer Rogi's question, I think Anderson Point has been established as a good deposit zone. That sand moves quickly. You know, you see slugs going along those groins that you showed in the picture before. It only takes a couple of storms before
Yeah, yeah.
that quantity
Yeah,
moves.
yeah.
So I don't think moving the sand further down the beach is the answer. I think catchment, like you've said,
Mm.
is pretty common sense.
Where you're dropping it, you can see the end of the pipe from here, eh? And it's a good position because it's at the top end and you get a few waves and down it goes. And you don't have to pump it too far and it keeps the cost down and it eventually leads on to the beaches. It must. And so I think there's no concern about where you're pumping it to. So the legacy, yeah, the legacy might be a big issue. The question that you'd have to address though, even if you put that 2.5 million, how long would it last? I think the studies are really needed to say, well, what is the net movement along that beach? You know, what is the longshore transport along that
It's
beach?
50,000.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's been measured.
It's
There's
been
a
actually
monitoring-
measured as well?
Yeah, there's a monitoring program in place now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot
How
of
is
work-
that measured?
Well, there's surveyors are taking beach measurements.
Yeah.
You know more about the measure, but
Yeah, I think the original
It's hard
model
to
was
measure, I'm sure.
developed by Peter Riddell,
Mm.
Foster and Gill.
Yeah.
So they did, you know, they didn't have the technology that we do now, but they estimated that
About
number.
50,
and
yeah.
it was-
Could be. I wouldn't be surprised. Somewhere between 50 and 150 is my guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yep,
I think
could be.
probably
Yeah.
one of the easier analysis is to take some contours of the sand that's built there since the first dropping of the stone in the early 50s, and
Mm.
you'll come up with a number, divide that by the years, and it's pretty much what,
Pretty much 50, yeah.
that's where the 50 basically came from.
Yeah, yeah. Yep. Which, if that's true, you know, you could put it and then you don't need structures, you know. I think, yeah. Yeah. And then the demand for structures is a function of who pays for it, of course, as well.
So,
Whether Delphi will pay for it or whether the council has to.
question over here, Pete.
Yeah.
Just, Richard,
Yep.
or we're both here,
Mm.
if the port was not to shift that sand, what's going to happen to the port?
But still.
So it's in the port's interest to shift that sand financially,
Yeah.
Mm.
to do that, so the more sand they shift.
Whether it all gets shifted in one go, though.
Well, I
yeah.
guess to answer your question, the
Very
obligation
expensive.
to the government keeps the port in check. So for us to shift 50,000 a year
Mm.
stops the harbour entrance from blocking and
Mm.
not allowing ships in, so therefore the business is in jeopardy. So if we continue to pump 50,000 a year, then it's business as usual.
Yeah, because we need to be a bit careful. I'm not negative on the port, except that make sure they're bypassing all sand that comes, yeah?
Well, that is
And
not
if there's a
right.
legacy there, but now they're bypassing all sand, there is an argument that if there's 50 going along that beach, and you'd put the 2.5 million out there 20 years ago, 1 million of that would have been lost already down at Port Ferry, yeah? So the question is, it's all about the budget, you know. It's all very well to, and sure, if you bang 2.5 million on that beach, it'll probably look fantastic for 20 years, yeah. So these are sort of balancing decisions, and It's nice to have that reserve, and it seems to me that a good preparatory process of deciding what you're going to do with that reserve, rather than just everyone arguing about picking it up and dropping it on the beach, is not a bad idea, because at least it gives you some process that you can work towards. In the end, I think someone's going to have to find money to pick up some of that sand that's sitting there, but that's a major benefit to the port, because why you're getting a lot coming around the end of your breakwaters, because it's all sitting on the breakwater, and you're getting 50 because there's so much sitting there. You know, if that was emptied, you'd probably have 10 years where you don't get the 50. So there's benefits all round with all this. Yeah.
Kerry, there's one in every crowd. The sort of time frame it seems to me that your work is focusing on is the here and now and the next 50 years. Have you had the luxury of sort of putting your well-informed lens into a longer time period? If so, what should we be looking at here to protect our assets for the next 100, 150, 200 years? What is this area?
Yeah, you know, so many other social and economic issues arise over that time period, but I think, you know, the number one thing is keeping your beach sand on your beaches, I think. And I think in the long haul, I know in the Indian case we've made a decision. The whole west coast of India is badly aligned. It's hungry down the whole coast. They're stealing the sand. It's too late to fix that. They build all the concrete buildings and it's a mess. So they're going to have to make some of these really big schemes where you bring major headlands out every 10 kilometres, realign all these beaches once and for all, accept a bit of downstream impact on the immediate downstream side, and start thinking in a global and a climate change sort of thing where you can't have beaches that are hungry because you can't find the sand. You're lucky there is some sand here. A lot of places they don't, you know, they know they've got a problem, but where they're going to get the sand from? There'll be no permits, there'll be no space they're allowed to pick it up from, you know, can't take it out of the mouth of the Murray probably and all that sort of thing. So they run into a lot of things. So I think we're going to have to start thinking. You know, I'm a bit early on getting anybody to want to do this because it's big money and it needs a grand scheme process. So that's where I think you need to go for your beaches and keep that sand there, and then the waves will push the sand up and the beach. Your coast should stay stable. Your cliffs will be in trouble, but your coast should stay stable. Yeah.
So, in your view, the port's committed legally to pump 50,000 cubic metres from behind the KS to Anderson Point, and I know they do it on a biennial, well, every 2 years. Now, the Dutton Way, Henny Estate, Narrabeen, what would be the solution, the long-term solution to hold that movement of sand to benefit everyone right through to, say, the Surrey River?
Yeah.
Including, you know, obviously Tim's got a huge economic problem there with his farm because it's been inundated a couple of times so closely. And we know that with your experience, rock walls are not the answer.
Not the long-term.
Not the long-term answer. So, if, for example, the port decided, well, with help, to pump more sand, but you have to build the barriers there to hold the sand.
But doesn't that just starve someone else?
Yeah, this is the issue. Yeah.
I mean,
it does.
Marina Beach is now better than what it's ever been. There's no doubt. I think we all agree with that.
Because all the sand's rushed down.
Well, it's at the top of the system. So, so long as they keep on sand bypassing, the advice that we've had is eventually the result at Maritimo will continue.
Yeah.
More stability along the coast.
Yeah, because in Australia things are a lot better. The beaches are more natural. Sand supply is more natural. I think the Murray, though, I think that's been absolutely. You know, there's a lot of water been taken out, so that's a completely different dynamic. But mostly, we would imagine that Australian beaches, if the sand wasn't interfered with, could survive. Yeah. And if you go into these really grand schemes, you've got to think big. You've got to go all the way from here to Warrnambool, basically, because you're going to have downstream effects. You stop the sand movement along Dutton Way, it won't get to you.
There is a spot.
Until it overflows.
There is a spot where the sand, the beaches say down towards Turrigarra and naturally replenished. They're not part of this system.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's the natural boundary,
And they say Yeah.
That's the benefit of the reefs is you rotate it and slow all the movement of sand up. Two, the way you do it is you run a big study, you figure out if 50's right, yeah, and you set these up to be on an angle that allows 50 to pass, yeah. Right now, they're on the wrong angle because of all the other issues that have happened. So you do that, and then you fill them with nourishment. You take the 2.5 million and you start filling these up. You don't allow natural capture because over the 5 years that this is building up on its own, your abalone farm's got nothing coming. The egg has all been blocked here. So you fill it with nourishment, so you reserve your 2.5 million to fill this. You do the study to get that on a 50,000 angle, and you might put it on 25 just to be really sure, yeah? And then you make sure the port puts 50 past every year, and you've basically got yourself a new stable system that's aligned, yeah?
Which, well, Nuns Beach is a stable system.
Yeah, it is, yeah. And it's on a completely different angle, much less wave energy, and there's a lot of reasons why that is, yeah. So that's your bigger picture. And then you have a program where you work your way down and you start trying to restore all these beaches properly. Now, if you wanted, you could put a wall in there and do exactly the same thing, but you tend to get a bit of cut on the backside, but you've already got rocks, so it may not matter if you have a little section that's cutting back to the rocks. Yeah. There are decisions to be taken that are done as part of a proper study process where everyone has a bit of a say.
Any more questions?
Yeah.
Kerry, you're talking about the nourishment. Well, that sand's got to come from somewhere. So how far upstream or up should you be looking to model? Because if that nourishment stops being supplied, then effectively it has to.
Yeah, that's right. And if you're a bit unsure about what supply is going to come, or if nature's going to change, or sea level's going to rise, or South Australia, yeah, you over-design this a bit. And instead of putting it on a 50,000 loss every year, you put it on a 0. And then it will eventually overflow anyway and find its own position. Because you might be a bit paranoid about designing it to deliberately leak 50 when you're not sure you're going to get 50. That's your question, yeah? Again, you need to know the numbers, you need to look pretty carefully at that, and then you pull that beach out by 5 degrees, or you pull it out by 8 degrees until you're happy that you're guaranteed that beach is going to stay stable. The more you pull it out, the more impact you have downstream for the first 3 or 4 years. And that's why you really need to build these with nourishment and not just let them capture naturally, because we'll have the entire ratepayer district complaining even more. So it's not a good thing. So there's a process in here you might go through that.
So I had a question, but you've kind of gone over it a number of times, but I guess one of the key things is which end you start. So I'll just add to that, if we were to add little groins from Nuns Beach onwards down to Baretamo, and then we pump 50,000 a year, then we get these nice little beach pockets like they've got in Point Lonsdale, and it's a great amenity and people enjoy Portland Foreshore a lot more. But then on the other hand, Tim's abalone farm's been starved through that process. So do you start at the other end to some degree? That's
if you're always going to have someone else downstream, that's the question. The other end might be Tim's farm, but whoever's living next to him is going to be shitty as hell. Yeah. So,
it's the crown.
So do you start at the other end?
No, you don't. What you do is you look at an option that is somewhere between your little low groins at Point Lonsdale or a reef offshore, whatever you're going to do, and you fill it with nourishment. And then you continue to supply your 50, and that 50, this beach is already full, so it doesn't capture anymore. You need very good computer design, you know what full is. You've got to determine what is full. You fill it, you might overfill it a little bit just to be safe, and then you let that natural process continue. If you put a wall in here, you're going to always have impacts here on a big storm.
So Nuns
you put
Beach
a reef, it'll run past.
Nuns Beach is an example of that. So it was overfilled back in '94.
Yeah.
And there was a little bit of loss, but it's pretty much stayed there ever since because of the little groin and the lighthouse.
No, that's good. And all nourishment has a construction design, which is usually an ugly horizontal on a drop, and then it has an expected final shape that it will have, and you're meant to lose sand off nourishment in the first instance. And the beach will find its own shape, and there's a lot of, you don't need to worry too much about that, but you just need to get the sand there and let nature take its course. So yeah, but you don't start at the downstream area because you don't know where downstream is, and it's really difficult to do that. You want to start where you can get this piece stable. You might build one wall or one roof here, get it all nice and beautiful. Everyone cheers up in the community, and then you say, right, it seemed to work well, we'll move down. And each time you put in whatever is needed here. It might be 100,000 something of cubic metres of sand needed to fill that up.
Another question here, Kerry?
Have you got a feel for the broad economics of a reef versus a groin? I know every scenario is different, but is economically, is it sort of 3 to 1 cost, 10 to 1 cost of a reef versus a groin, or just instinctively? You got a feel for that ratio?
It's a good, very, question that is really important, of course. If you go up, right up that one. One of the issues in that cost comparison, the first one is that a 100 metre long reef will protect about 400 metres of coast. So you've immediately got a 4 to 1 ratio here. So a rock wall is smaller, cheaper, no doubt, but you've got to build the whole length. So you've got about a 4 to 1. It's a minimum 4 to 1. You can get up to 8 to 1, but to be conservative, 4 to 1. The other thing that matters, of course, the biggest issue is how far offshore you want to go and how deep is it. And then the third thing that matters is it sandy or rock ledge? If it's sandy, you've got to allow for all the sinkage and all the subs. You've got to be building a really good structure that doesn't sink. On average, I'd say that a reef is like twice the price of a groin overall. A groin has the other massive benefit. You can just drive from the land out and drop the rocks. It's insanely easy to build, you know. A reef, you can make a causeway and then pull it out as you come back, or you might have to do it offshore. The other option that matters too, if you want to put surfing on a reef, it's actually got to have a bigger footprint, and it pushes the price up by about 1.5 times. The steel ones we're building in India, though, have turned out to be incredibly cheap and lifespan of 20 to 30 years. And really easy to build because any fabricator can build them, and they're hollow, so they're built on the edge of the water, pulled out off a port, say, off the sand, floated out, and then you open the holes and the water goes in, it sinks down. You don't need, and they're very broad weight to surface area ratio, very good ratio, so they don't sink. So you don't need to prepare the bed underneath. You don't need a lot of rocks under anything. So they're turning out to be quite cheap. And prior to that, we were using geotextiles, and absolute rubbish. I'm totally over them. They've destroyed my life for 15 years, basically. The caps come off. The geotextiles don't last. They're very good for surfing and very good for marine life, but they're not good for longevity. So we moved over to steel on the latest one. And but if you just want to make a rock wall offshore, it's basically all you're doing is picking up your rock wall on the beach, putting it out offshore, and you're probably multiplying the volume up by 5 times or something, 10 times, depending on the water depth. Yeah.
Quick question. You were first.
Just on that, so the rock in our rock walls is appropriate for reef structures?
The rocks, no, not perfect. No, some of them are. Some of them are quite big. The big ones on the top are good.
Yep.
Yeah, you could, and they would make a good groin. You could pick up a length of coast and turn it offshore, easy. And then you've got to build the head. You might put some concrete tetrapods or armorstone or something. But yeah, you could do that. And I don't know if anyone would accept that, but you might do that on the second one. You build the first groin and get your nice beach, everyone's happy, and then you pull the rocks out from behind and use that to make the next groin if you want groins, or pick it up and put it offshore and make reefs, yeah. But so you would need a protective layer on top. You could use a lot of the rock, but on top you'd need your tetrapods.
So we've got a lot of material out there that could be utilised.
You've got a lot of material, and you've got a lot of natural reefs along the coast, which make perfectly
in front of the Abalone.
Yeah, perfectly good locations for.
But Trevor's got a question.
Yeah.
You made the comment earlier that your management structure
in one of your reef projects fell apart, so they took the reef out. So if we accept that model and, you know, put these reefs in, where does it sit, and who decides when it works, and who decides we don't like that, so we pull it out?
Yeah.
How does that all fit together?
That reef was the world's first and the world's last publicly funded.
Yep.
I set up it's a crazy story. I had a PhD student who was studying reefs, and I said, why don't we do an assessment of where to build one, and a full assessment as part of his study. Then it got into the public domain, and everyone thought we were building a reef, and so I said, well, why don't we try and build a reef? So we set up a little committee of management, just people, and we raised the consents in this committee through the full legal process with the environmental. In New Zealand, slightly different structure, but anyway, we got the consent. We built it out of public money, and then our committee just got tired. And like 7, 8 years in, everyone fled. I went overseas. I was in charge of it. And everyone just gave up, and then that needed renewing after 5 years under the consent we got in New Zealand, which is not what you'd have here. You'd get a proper consent as your coastal protection structure, and that'd be it. Same as any other structure. It was just the way we did it, and no one wanted to start again. And so it hit a bureaucratic hurdle, and the poor old regional council in charge thought, well, like, we don't have an owner. And so they had to pull it out. So it was a very unusual case.
It's hugely expensive to pull it out.
Yeah, I hated it, you know. I stayed overseas because I would have cried if I had to stand there and watch it.
So they don't have, normally they don't normally have ownership.
No, that's right. You wouldn't have that here. Be exactly the same as any other coastal structure, or a seawall or a groin or whatever. The permitting would be the same. And the ownership wouldn't expire, you know, like it did in New Zealand. So it's not a problem, yeah.
Okay, folks, I guess we should wrap it up. Just in conclusion, we're very fortunate to have Kerry here today to hear what he said. So I hope you've learned a few things today. And because we do live in an island nation, the strategies that we have to